As Luke is recording, and been reading about that in the last couple of days, the early ministry of Jesus, he also puts into this particular part of his gospel a genealogy showing who Jesus was and where he had come from. Now, a lot of people today are very interested to try to develop a family tree. Well, the Jews had these family trees, and they could trace their way back not just through one or two generations, but many generations. An actual record was kept of who they were and where they'd come from. Let's look back for a moment into the Old Testament. When the Jews were taken away into captivity in Babylon, they were there for 70 years. And then a large group of them returned to Israel when Cyrus, in fact, released them and allowed them to go home. But sometime after that, we get Asaph, a great leader in Israel, decides to set down a record of who people were so that they would know their descent and where they'd come from. And of course, these are the books we've given as the books of Chronicles. In our Bible, the books of Chronicles follows the books of Kings. But in the Jewish Bible, the books of Chronicles comes at the end of the Old Testament. Because this was Asaph showing the individuals who they were. And if you go into the book of Chronicles, you'll find you sometimes can get very bored because there's list after list after list showing people who they were, where they'd come from, who their ancestors were, and where they fitted within Jewish society. The books of Chronicles. And Luke does the same thing now for Jesus. Matthew, when he tries to do the same thing, traces Jesus' descent from Abram and comes from Abram down to David and then to David's son Solomon and down through the kings of Israel. But Luke, on the other hand, starts in a different place because he starts with Mary. But now, never mentioning Mary, of course, goes back to Mary's father, Heli. And it says Jesus was in fact the son of Heli, not of Joseph, of Heli. It is Mary's father he deals with. And amazingly, he tracks his genealogy right the way back, not through Solomon, the son of David, but through the second son, through Nathan. He goes back through Nathan and then to David. Then through David, he moves back to Abram. And from Abram, he goes right the way back to Adam himself. Because Luke wants to show that Jesus was not just a member of the Jewish race, not just a child of Abram that God had called and made the covenants with, but in fact, this was the person that God had promised even from the time of Adam. This was the person who would come into the world as God's solution to the world's problems. But I get back again to where we finished off yesterday. Jesus had healed a leper, and he was at home. And a group of people from the Sanhedrin, realizing that something very special had happened, come to visit. Now, they were sent out by the Sanhedrin with a special instruction. The first thing they had to do is that they had to go to the person and they had to listen to what he was saying and watch what he was doing. They weren't allowed to ask questions. Then they would report back to the Sanhedrin. This is the way it worked. And the Sanhedrin would read their report. Then they would go back again and challenge the person to find out whether this was the Messiah or not. You see, the Sanhedrin had a special interest in this. They were supposed to keep the people within the will of God and doing the will of God until the Messiah came. And they had to find out if Jesus was the Messiah. So they come to him in that house in Capernaum, and they sit and they watch him. And something strange happens. Because 4 men bring a friend who is paralyzed, and they can't get into the house. It's full of people, full of rabbis from Jerusalem. They don't know what to do. So they go up on the flat roof of the house, and they pull up the palm fronds which were on the roof, acting like a form of slate. They dig their way through the roof because they can't get near Jesus, and they lower their paralyzed friend into the house right in front of Jesus. Remember, this is Jesus' house, and they lower him down. Jesus doesn't criticize them. He looks at the person. He probably knew him because he lived in the same town. These were small towns and people knew each other. And he says to the man on the stretcher, "Your sins are forgiven." The people there watching must have caused them terrible problems. They couldn't ask questions. But this man was claiming to forgive sins. Who was he? What sort of authority did he have? Could he really have this type of authority? And then Jesus turns to them and he says, "Is it easier to say your sins are forgiven, or to say get up and walk? But to show you I have this authority," he turns to the man on the stretcher and he says, "Now get up and go home." And the man does so. Amen.